call to order a meeting of the Springfield Township Board of Trustees for a zoning hearing. It's June 25th, 2014 at 4:30 p.m. This is a public hearing to hear zoning commission case ZC 2014-01, which are text amendments to the Springfield Township zoning resolution. Mr. Burning, may we please have a roll call?
Yes, Mr. Hanwell. Mr. Burning? Present. Ms. McFarland?
Present.
Mr. Hanwell?
Present.
All trustees are present.
As I said, this is case number ZC 2014-01. This is a request to amend the zoning resolution regarding defining persons in control of property and electronic message board signs. I would like to give a brief overview of the proceeding for this evening. This case will be handled in the following order. Mr. Gilbert will present the staff report for the case and will answer questions from the board. Upon completion of board questions, we will hear from proponents and opponents of the proposed text amendment. We will then close the discussion portion of the hearing and continue with the board's deliberation in public. With that, then, Mr. Gilbert, can we have the staff report?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Hunwell. This evening, before you are the text amendments that the board asked staff to draft, and the same text amendments that were initiated by the board by passing the resolution at your May work session meeting, if you remember. These text amendments essentially are really two different issues. The first issue related to electronic message board signs, as the board is aware, since the adoption of the zoning code back in 2004, we've never really anticipated that the technology would exist that allows signs to do what they do now, and that churches would be utilizing them as often as they are now. And therefore, these signs are starting to crop up in residential zone districts. As a result of that, the township had received various concerns and complaints by neighbors that live in these particular areas where it is primarily residential, where church may be located, but still want to utilize electronic message board signs. In an effort to allow the ability of churches and residency zone districts to continue to use these type of signs, possibly, and at the same time allow the township to better control them where they may not be appropriate, or to place conditions upon their placement to make them more amenable to a residential character. We looked at rezoning, making an amendment to the zoning resolution that would require them to be a conditional use in residential zone districts. What this essentially would do would require any church or any user for that purpose, for that matter, that's in the residency zone area, have to go before the board of zoning appeals to have their sign approved as a conditional use. At that time, the BZA can look at those particular cases on a case-by-case basis and determine whether or not that sign is appropriate for that given residential area. Even if they do find that it's appropriate, they will have the ability to place conditions upon that approval that may mitigate any negative effects that sign may possibly have. So essentially, the text amendments you see before you regarding the electronic message signs basically turns them into a conditional use in residential zone areas and requires them to go through that process. The second part of the text amendment that you have before you is a request by the Hingham County Housing Board to revise in our definitions who we deem as the person in control of property. It really doesn't necessarily change, it just expands it a little bit and provides them greater flexibility and I guess, determination of who's in control of property for adjudication process in the housing board for zoning violations. This was their language, at their direction, and their request, and indicated that if we don't make these changes, we wouldn't be able to utilize the Hingham County Housing Board to take our zoning violations to them to have them processed. So that is what this change is for. And really, pretty straightforward, nothing out of the ordinary with really either one of these text amendments. The Planning Commission did review and approve the text amendment, or recommend approval of the text amendments, as well as the Zoning Commission of Springfield Township did as well. So what you have before you tonight is recommended text amendments that have been reviewed and approved by both County Planning Commission and the Township Zoning Commission. That concludes my staff report, unless there are any questions of the board.
The only thing that I was, as I read this, Chris, I was thinking about was, what if you had a daycare in a residential district? Could they put up one of these signs?
Well, again, they would have to go to the board of zoning appeals, the board of zoning appeals would have to approve or deny,
The whole daycare?
Currently, daycares are no longer permitted in residential zone areas. So it would have to be an existing daycare that was put in place under previous zoning laws that allowed it at the time. Additionally, daycares are not permitted to have any signage like churches. In the zoning code, it specifically permits churches to have signs up to a certain square footage.
Okay.
Those same permissions aren't afforded to daycares.
Okay. That was just my
Yeah.
only.
Either way,
Yeah.
they would be required to go to the board of zoning appeals.
Gotcha.
So this is specific to churches. I said churches mainly because those are the entities that have been utilizing these signs.
Right.
But this requires any user in a residential area, regardless if it's a church, a school, or anyone.
And-
If they want to put up one of these signs, they have to go to the board of zoning appeals.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay, that was the one question I had. Any other questions from the board?
No, I think it seems, pretty clear.
So anybody can go do this, these are just some examples of people who would.
Well,
Anybody can appeal.
anybody can, yes and no. There are certain uses in residentially zoned areas where the zoning code says you can have this type of sign, you can have this size of sign. For example, if you have a home occupation, it only allows you to have a certain size sign, right? I can tell you the size that the code allows for home occupations, they don't make electronic signs that size. It's such a small size. So the main purpose of this is to regulate them for churches and schools because frankly, under the zoning code, those are the only two types of uses in residential zone areas that can have a sign of a size that would qualify as a electronic.
And also keep electronic signs out of residential areas as possible. Because they're already kind of excluded because the size is too small.
Yes and no. I mean, for example, St. Bart's, Jean Paul II, is a residentially, it's zoned residential, but it's on Wind Road, as opposed to, let's say, Finneytown High School, which is on Fountain in the middle of a residential neighborhood.
So they put their.
Both. Right, but my point is, both residentially zoned, it's probably more appropriate to put a sign like this on Wind Road versus back on Fountain, right? That's why we're requiring to go to the board of appeal, so the board can make those determinations.
What you have in every zoning code is you've got uses that are ordinance principally permitted, meaning this use is allowed in this zone, walking in the minimum development standards, setbacks is permitted. Then you have the conditional uses, in which you're saying that under certain circumstances, or with particular conditions being applied by the board of zoning appeals, it may or may not be permitted. And I think the example of an electronic sign where you say, well, St. Bart's or a church that's on Wind Road, the 5-lane, 4-lane thoroughfare, maybe that makes more sense because of where it's located, whereas the church on a side street, you wouldn't really want that because there's probably no way you can there's no condition you can place on that sign that's going to mitigate its impact. And that's generally what the Board of Zoning Appeals does. The conditional uses, they evaluate it, they determine, are there conditions that we can apply, or maybe what those negative things are, or in some cases, they simply say, there are no conditions, and therefore we apply, that are going to modify it. So in those cases, those would be a circumstance in which a conditional use would be denied.
And there are standards by which the board of zoning appeals uses when they evaluate conditional uses. It isn't just an arbitrary decision. They actually have standards that they use and look at and determining whether or not a conditional use should be approved.
Okay, very good. All right. No other questions of the board? Are there any opponents who would like to speak here today regarding this case? reflect that there are neither. We are now going to close the public portion for board deliberation. Do we have a motion to do so?
So moved.
Seconded?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Motion carried.
I mean, I think this is what we've been working on for quite a while. In
Yes.
fact, we had this before the board before. There was a timing issue with the planning commission downtown for them getting it done. So this is what we've talked about for quite a while, and it's something that we have a resolution here later.
I may add, this public hearing was advertised as a legal ad under the requirements of the statute.
Okay.
Motion to pass this statute.
This will be.
We will take action.
After work session.
That's my question.
Okay. Any other issues before the board on this case?
I have none.
Okay, then do we have a motion to adjourn the public hearing?
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Hearing's closed.
Motion passes, the public hearing is adjourned.